Hey guys, Veronica here. So today I'd like to spend some time talking about mulch. Now I think that this is a great opportunity to show you around the garden since it's been about a month now and get a feel for how quickly things grow and what you can accomplish in a month's time. Now, when I first started gardening, I didn't really look at mulch as something that I needed until we got closer to summertime. So it really was this sort of like water retention, put it around your tomatoes so the roots don't get too hot and it doesn't stop blooming, or put it around your trees to help conserve water so that those feeder roots don't dry out. But really, mulch is so much more than that. It really is a dynamic way to help protect the soil microbes, to help retain water as that purpose goes, and also help feed the soil. So I think when people think of mulch, they tend to think of stuff like this, usually some level of wood chips or, chipped tree and forest material. If you go to the store, a big box store, and buy a bag of something, it's typically going to look like this. It's going to be chipped wood if you're buying a bag of mulch. But there are so many things that you can use for mulch beyond wood chips. And so I think that a few of the things that we need to keep in mind in this space are things like decay rate. How quickly does the green or brown organic matter that you're using as mulch break down in its environment? This will be impacted, of course, by how much precipitation you get, how humid your environment is. If you live in the tropics, things break down a lot faster than if you live in the desert Southwest, or if you live, in someplace else that's really dry and arid. So keeping all of these things in mind, it's really about, I think what my goal and objective is with this piece today is to kind of go through like the mental process as usual, or my own mental process in terms of, what can I use to accomplish the goals that I have in mind in the garden. So without further ado, we're going to kind of poke around a little. As I mentioned, we have a lot of this like chipped wood mulch. I think that there are a few old, probably sick or rotten trees kind of in this area. And there's a lot of wood mulch. And wood mulch is a very acceptable mulch in the garden and in the yard. It really does break down and make nice soil. The biggest issue with using wood mulch is that you're looking at several years of decomposition under ideal sort of climate situations, plenty of precipitation and whatnot to get really the fungal mass growing in there and breaking down a lot of the wood into like a more usable substrate, aka soil. So wood chips are really great if you have access to them. But for people who don't have access to wood chips, if you can't, get a chip drop in your area where you just get a dump truck full of wood chips, or you don't have any laying around, you don't have a wood chip or whatever, there's other stuff you can use for mulch. So let's do a little walk around the yard. We're going to talk about that and maybe hopefully help answer some of your questions in this space. So one of the things, going back to like what I was doing in Texas too, and I'll throw some pictures up here, but one of the things that I really like doing when I'm starting to grow, and if I'm growing in a spot where I don't have access to tons of irrigation, is I'll use like really fresh green matter, like this frondy little tree here behind me. Green matter like that, things that are really nice and soft, and kind of do like these little piles or layers across the places that I've planted seeds. One, because as that breaks down, it's going to create some level of moisture on the soil surface to help that seed germinate. And so there's like weird little tricks where if you do the mental gymnastics and talk yourself through the problem and you're like, okay, if I do this, what's it going to do? And look at all of the things. So it's like if I use green matter as a mulch instead of brown matter, it's going to provide some level of moisture to the soil. It might also attract some fungi. It could be good or bad. But if you're adding in good fungi, then it's probably, those are going to outright or override the bad. There's a lot there, but suffice it to say that one of the things that I love to do is surround, freshly planted seeds with green matter if I don't have, really well decomposed mulch to work with. I'm just kind of really working through all the stuff you'd put in your compost pile, but going directly into your beds or rows to help continue building that soil and support those plants. I've definitely watered seeds just with freshly cut stuff. It's not efficient because you do have to update or like add more of it every couple of days or every day sometimes, depending on how hot it is. But it is an effective mechanism to get your seed from point A to point B. If you're looking at this tree behind me, I did a little Craigslist excursion earlier this week or last, I don't know, a couple days ago. It was the first time I left the house in 5 weeks, and it was to go dig up a tree that was at a construction site. It's a little lemon tree. And so he's looking worse for the wear, just because he's missing about half to, I'd say half to like 2/3 of like these massive roots that were kind of growing under the house that somebody was working on and said, come get this tree. So of course I show up, but hoping to revive that guy. I've got a lot of stuff going on in the soil. I mention M1 because I know you're looking in the background going, Veronica's got a dead tree. What's up with that? It's not dead. It's just a little bit shocked. 2, there's a lot of mulch going on down there. So again, in talking about the mulching process, I'm using wood mulch there. I want to try to establish some really strong mycorrhizal relationships with those roots so that we can get the roots growing again quickly. Now, if we look into these beds here next to me, I'm doing some chop and drop mulch in here, and it's kind of a hot mess because I've taken on helping with homeschool around here in the last few weeks, so I haven't had a lot of time in the garden. We're still kind of trying to figure out how to navigate that. But you can see here, like over here in this space, these brown spots in the pathways, that's really just the weeds that exist in this space. And all I do is I go through with a pair of pruning shears, maybe with like my tiny machete, and just hack all of the tops back, leaving the roots in place. I don't want to disturb any of the soil or the organisms in it unless I think that I absolutely need to. And then everything growing in between right now, there's a lot of little baby crops and also some cover crops, which we'll talk about here in a second as a mulch component. But I like to leave as much, you'll see as much like grass and native plants as possible. Some people say this attracts insects. I do not agree. I think that it gives the native wildlife, again, as I've mentioned previously, something to eat so that they don't go straight for my plants. And there's no real wildlife barrier other in this space so far, other than the insect netting I have over the tomato row that I still haven't had a chance to plant. But you can see that even though I have these sort of, these sort of very open cover crop spaces, like we can get closer in and I'll put a close up in here, but there's not, insect damage, pest damage, birds, squirrels, like I haven't, knock on wood, but I haven't really had, much trouble with them. And aside from well, there's a little gopher hole there. But aside from gopher holes every so often, I haven't had much issues with much of anything in this space. And I do firmly believe it's because there's all of this other native greenery for them to eat, and they prefer that. So keeping that in mind, I mentioned we were going to talk about green mulch, living mulch, cover crop mulch. This is something that I will constantly talk about. And there's a really good reason for that. So if you remember back when we first started, or I first started in this space and planted all of this, it's like a month ago now, right? Like barely a month ago. And so now we have this cover crop strip. It's the same cover crops that I was using in the fall because that's what I had on hand. And you can kind of see like what performs better in various seasons. But basically I dug just enough or scratched up just enough earth here to get those cover crops in the ground. And then once they started looking pretty well established, what I do from there is I scratch enough earth out in the other 2 directions so that I can plant whatever other crops that are going to go in there. And so this one is really going to be a mashup of beans and grains, and there's some onions in there that are not close to the beans because they don't get along. But yeah, a lot of grains, some herbs, some other greens. And really I do these sort of living mulch cover crop strips down the middle for 2 reasons. One, because as it starts to get a little more hot, I can start chopping and dropping them across, my main crops, and they'll continue to grow as long as they're irrigated. They might try to go to seed at some point, but I'll be using them to chop and drop to sort of create this like island of biology that is starting to gather and accumulate nutrients underground. And the minute that they get chopped for mulch, those nutrients start to release and, move out into the rows. Now, it's not like an immediate, like, oh, suddenly there's more nitrogen, but we are looking forward in a longer term way to continue to feed the soil. So starting with soil that felt pretty good, that looked pretty good, adding a little bit of supplements to help support, these cover crops I put in, as well as the beans and grains in this row, the melons and stuff that'll go in this row, the tomatoes that go in that row. And then, looking forward to continue feeding that space rather than scrambling in the fall or spring to do all these amendments and whatnot. It's like, well, let's constantly have those amendments in place via green mulch, via chop and drop, via chopping weeds down to mulch, via, this is another example. This just has leaf mulch. And leaf mulch or leaf mold is a really nice option. These peas are looking great. And again, all of this has grown over the last 3 to 4 weeks. So you can kind of look back and see what I planted when. But all of these various mulches serving very similar functions, but also looking at, whatever you're trying to achieve and what you have to work with. So right in here, again, this is a space that we did some wildflowers, some buckwheat, some clover, just using, I'll squat down here to take a look. So this is just using some leaf mulch. And so we have a pretty ample duff layer here, as you can see. And I don't think, this one is not particularly active with any sort of mycorrhizal stuff. But I have been considering mixing in some of the stuff in the back, which we can go and I'll show you sort of the fungal networks that are going there. Mixing some of that into here to get it a little bit more inoculated so that we have, that structure in place, or all of the things that we need in order to build soil structure in place, really. So a few things when we're talking about using green matter, and I'll just give you the examples that I have here in the yard because that's what I have to show you. But if you have a space where you're like, oh, I'm just working with this compacted clay, I can't afford to go get soil or mulch or whatever. And one of the things that I would highly recommend doing, even if you're not growing right this second, but maybe you have a really bad patch of land that you have a space to experiment with, right? And so one of the things I'd highly, highly recommend doing is going through and digging trenches. If you're not composting, dig a trench and just start burying your compost if you have a spot, especially in bad soil. Get yourself a nice long trench going and just drop your compost in there and then just bury it. And do that and kind of mark where it's at. And 2, if you have any greenery growing someplace that is these weedy sort of plants that maybe you don't want, and rather than pulling them out, because then you're making bare soil somewhere else, right? So it's cutting off your nose to spite your face or whatever the saying is. So rather than pulling stuff out, going around and, taking your lawn trimmings, dumping your lawnmower basket or raking after you weed eat or whatever. I mean, you can leave it in place if you want to build soil where you're doing that. But if you have a bunch of tall weeds somewhere, I have tall grass over there, but you can use that too to start, building a garden where you want it. Now, you might be thinking, oh, but there's a bunch of weed seeds and all of that, and I don't want that in that spot. Well, you got a spot that has bare soil that's hard and compacted. You want whatever you can get to grow there right now, to be honest. Once those seeds germinate in the next season, then you can stop the cycle there and you can cut them sooner. But right now you're just looking, and I'm just looking to cover these spots to start building a much nicer soil in spots where there's not nice soil. So just kind of going over the various things. Really soft stuff like this, really soft greens. The soft greens also would include things like miner's lettuce. I don't actually know what this is called, but it has a sharp seed to it. So there's various really soft spring greens are not going to be persistent as a mulch layer. They tend to break down pretty quickly. So I would not look to them as a forever plan, but in combination with things like grasses. This is a grass. Even again with the seed heads, if you're working with really shoddy soil someplace, if you have a patch that's just horrible, don't be afraid to mulch it with things that have seed heads, because you can, end that cycle next season versus worrying about it too much this season. Just start getting that soil really built up. So yeah, trench, compost, and then just start mulching on top with whatever, grasses and greens you have access to. The grass I've found to be a little more persistent. Again, it's about as persistent as straw. So maybe even not quite that much, because depending on how thin the grass is. This is all, again, leaf mulch back here. I direct seed into that. This one looks pretty bare because I was not irrigating it very well, and also the gophers have kind of claimed that as one of their spots, which is fine. Like if they want to run the fence line, that's cool, and I'll let them have it because it's shady. This is another spot that was leaf mulched, and this was one of the earlier green spots that I planted, that one, and then also that one on that side. And so you can see as we hit the month mark here, and I'll grab you, it's like little baby kale here. I could just go in for a close-up, I suppose. But so yeah, we got like these tiny little leaves now that are starting to pop up and be harvestable. So it does take a minute to really get stuff going. I suppose there are ways to like move things along faster. I have transplants that, it was actually a mustard, that was not a kale. But I have transplants that are almost the same size, and I guess they were started at the same time. So I don't know that you could get things going totally faster. Perhaps if you like over cultivate and want to deal with weeding and whatnot. But I mean, I just kind of spray these guys with water. When I planted them, most of them have the same planting depth, and so it's again one of the broadcast mixes I do where I mix a bunch of seeds together with some compost and some amendments. Rake, leaves back if there's leaves in place, scatter the seeds about, and then cover it with leaves or cover it with mulch or cover it with compost. Nothing that's going to be super heavy, but something that will be persistent enough to kind of weigh it down in place, because the seeds will find their way out. They always do. So don't be afraid to, use, I'd say probably leaf mulch or leaf mold before wood chips, unless you just have really strong seedlings. But then go back through, and add a little bit more from there. So another thing, this is what I like to use grass if I'm going to do like green mulches and I don't have a cover crops or another green manure to use. But yeah, I just love using grasses like this because you have these very thick stems, and so the persistence there is then like hay or straw, which is still less than leaves, less than wood. But if you're kind of trying to get, a good balance in your space, I'll sometimes take these. That was something I did in Texas. Is I would take, grass or peas or whatever I had access to really, and I'd make little nests to put around my seedlings in the field, which seems tedious, but also it worked. Like I didn't have to go irrigate. I would just make them little fresh nests every couple of days. And, I had some pretty solid seedlings out there without actually running irrigation. So if you're growing in a spot that has poor soil, if you're growing in a spot where you don't have access to irrigation, or you don't have perhaps the finances for the infrastructure right now, don't be afraid to try and grow there still. But also keep in mind all of the variables that are at play, and try to set yourself up for success in terms of, like, yeah, you do have to build some soil that you can get stuff into. Yeah, you do have to continue building soil throughout the growing season in order to avoid the use of chemical fertilizers. And composting is your best friend still. That's always going to be a big thing around here. This is getting a little long, but speaking of compost, there's this guy. I love that I'm able to grab some yard scraps every so often from the green bin, that there's a couple of yard guys that come here and cut everything except for this space, because I came out and yelled at them the first day I saw it. But yeah, they trim up everything else. And then I take the green bin after they're done and I dump it into my compost pile. So between that and the chickens, we're gonna have some really bomb compost here in a few months. So that's exciting. This was the last thing before I close this out, because I just remembered that I told you guys we were gonna talk about the fungal mass in the soil. And I probably came to the corner that I've dug too much at this point, but let's see. So one of the nice things about working with the wood chips, there's the word, you'll get this sort of fungal biomass that's growing on a lot of the wood more easily. Now, something that I've noticed, I wanted to mention this too because it's super cool. I've been playing with this experiment now for 3 weeks. So something I noticed right off the bat, And one of the things that might help in terms of like you inspecting a new place or your own place, if you're just getting started, is there was no like rhizobia, any of like the root nitrogen fixing bacteria in this yard, like none that was visible at least. And I noticed this because let me find a good leguminous plant to share with you. And I'll hopefully not pull one up that has it now. But I noticed this because I was walking all over the yard, kind of doing my, typical sort of inspection stuff. And every leguminous plant that I pulled up, so if it was like vetch or clover or whatever, I'm gonna see if I can get some roots out because I just found a good chunk of vetch. Anyway, the roots were like just really straight tap roots because I pulled it up going, okay, let's see what the soil's doing. And yeah, here's an example. So the roots were like really straight tap roots with very few side roots and 0 nodules. And that kind of concerned me because that basically meant that this soil is spinning its wheels in terms of, dynamic accumulation of nutrients by the rhizosphere in the soil, by all of the microbes that live in it. And so I put out my cover crops in my rows because without nitrogen fixing bacteria, the way that I grow it'll deplete the space pretty quickly, to be honest, without all of like the biology in place. And so I put my cover crops out knowing they were pre-inoculated, the seeds were pre-inoculated with some levels of rhizobium, and not sure that they were still alive because I bought those seeds back in like October or whenever last fall, and have been dragging around from Texas to various spots in California. But I noticed yesterday, and I'll give you the little screenshot of like my Insta story here. I noticed yesterday that as I was weeding out some, burr clover? Yeah, I was weeding out some burr clover, and I was gonna see if I could find any. There's not any in this row, but I was weeding out some burr clover in another row. And it was in the row with the cover crops. And so I noticed that the roots, instead of that one tap root and like very few secondary or side roots, it was lots of secondary roots. And there was like very early nodulation happening. So I know that the nitrogen fixing bacteria, those on my cover crop seeds, is still alive and well in its dormancy phase, or like, I guess still fresh enough to reactivate, which was cool. And now I can start, applying that biology across the entire yard as I pull some of those things out. Now, if you pull it out, it's not going to leave the nitrogen in the soil in that spot, but just learning how to manipulate this stuff. I know that if it feels like really over your head, it's okay, because I've been in that space. I've been exploring this space for a while. If you want, we'll do the link at the end to be back to the pea video that I did last year, and you can see like just the quantum leap that's happened between last year and this year in terms of understanding this level of biology. But suffice it to say that if you start pulling up things like clover, things like vetch, this is clover. Clover is your like 3-leaf plants. So things like that, things like the vetch. I don't know if I held up the greens actually. This is vetch. This is kind of native in a lot of places. And yeah, if you start pulling those up and you notice that the roots are not, there's no nodulation happening, there's not a lot of side roots, then the odds of your leguminous plants, wild or cultivated or otherwise, fixing any level of nitrogen in your soil, meaning helping your soil to retain that so it's bioavailable to other crops, the odds are really low. And so you have to get the biology in the soil in order for it to be effective. It can't just be planting the plants and hoping that they like somehow pull it out of thin air. Now, it's very rare that it won't exist in the soil. I haven't figured out why it doesn't exist in the soil here particular. Because in Texas, in that like hard packed clay, I still was able, it still showed up. And those were not, the peas that I did last spring were not pre-treated with any sort of inoculant. So Lots of questions, lots of answers to come. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. As always, if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, ding that bell, and follow me on Instagram at FlavorKit for all of this sort of stuff and more. A lot of the secondary shots that I show you guys are from Insta stories. And so if you're looking to make those jumps really fast, that's a great place to join us. And until next time, happy gardening.